Okay, we are at Federal Hall. This is where it all began. This is where the first presidency began. This is where George Washington took the oath of office. Just picture the scene. The crowd filled Wall Street, and up on the balcony, surrounded by some of his favorite people and some of his enemies, it's John Adams, it's Thomas Jefferson, it's Alexander Hamilton, all surrounded around him, while the soft-spoken general of the Continental Army was getting sworn in as the President of the United States. And he added something a little bit special to the end of his swearing in. He had his hand on a Bible, and it's a famous Bible. The Bible ends up being stored here for many years. It's still here. But it ends up being the same Bible used by Jimmy Carter and used by George H.W. Bush when they swore in as president. And at the end of his swearing in, after he promised to defend the Constitution, after he promised to defend the United States, he threw in, very soft-spokenly, "So help me God. So help me God." And then with everybody kind of like waiting around to see what George Washington was going to do, he surprised everybody by going for a walk. And where he ended up, well, that fits the story. So we're here on Wall Street at the stock exchange. This is where it all began. And where was George Washington going? Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Let's see where he's going. So if you look down here, you can see the remnants of the original Wall Street. That's right. Wall Street was named after an actual wall that existed here that separated New Amsterdam from the northern part of what would become as Manhattan to keep the Native Americans out. Not so cool. All right, but let's go. Let's see where George Washington was going. Okay, we're at Trinity Church. Well, George Washington walked right by Trinity Church because there was no Trinity Church then. It was there before and it was there after, but in between, something happened. It got burnt down, one of the two major fires in Lower Manhattan. So Trinity Church wasn't there. It would have been where George Washington would have gone, because that's where the more famous people went. That's where the sons of the Revolution and people who had a lot of money went. But it wasn't there. So George Washington ended up at a much more humble location. All right. Okay, we're on Broadway, and this is where George Washington walked down to his more humble location. And Broadway was broad. It was big. That's why it was called Broadway. And we just came from Broad Street. Broad Street and Broadway were once one big street. So imagine George Washington walking down this huge avenue with all these people around him on the way to, they have no clue where he's going. But he's on his way to a more humble location than Trinity. Come on. Okay, we're at St. Paul's, and this is where George Washington came. And he came to pray. He wanted to spend his first moments as president praying, and he came to this very humble church. Well, it was more humble back then. Now, it was a pretty big deal. But he came to this much more humble church, more uptown from Trinity, where he could pray and really take in the magnitude of the moment. This church is now famous in New York history because, one, it survived that great fire, and two, it is right in the shadow of where the old World Trade Center was and where the new one is. And it's one of the only surrounding buildings that wasn't damaged in the fall of the Twin Towers. So it's got a reputation. They refer to it as the little chapel that stood. And it took minimal damage, and a lot of people were safe staying there. That's it. 44. I'm done.